All right, folks, if you're just joining us, we are waiting for a few folks to log in, and we'll go ahead and get started in about 30 seconds. All right, well, I wasn't actually keeping very good count, but I think that was about 30 seconds, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, First off, just want to thank all of you for joining us for our February update of the 2026 legislative session. We have quite a few updates from our January webinar, so very excited to have you all here so you can learn about what's going on in the Capitol and hopefully get a little bit of context for some of the confusing things you might be seeing in the media right now. So we'll go ahead and get started with introductions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kendra Knighten, and I'm the Policy Director with the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. I oversee our entire policy agenda, but I specifically focus on criminal justice and housing policy. And I've been working in Idaho politics for I think 14 years now. I think we determined this was my 14th legislative session. Um, and yeah, I'll pass it over to May to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm May Roberts. I'm a policy analyst with the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, and I specialize in tax budget and the education budget. And I've been, let's see, this is my third legislative session. So I've been here for a little, like 3.5 years now.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, May. Um, I'm sure many of you know that May is absolutely our expert when it comes to tax policy and education policy, and we would all be lost without her. So, always excited to have her on these updates. Before we get started on the actual updates, just want to do some quick housekeeping. Everybody on this webinar is muted just to make sure that we have time to get through all the content that we have to share. But we are very open to questions. So if you do have a question about any of the things that we're talking about, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. You can find it at the bottom of your webinar screen. We will try to answer as many of them as we can during the webinar. But if we're not able to get to it, we can reach out to you by email and connect with you offline. Um, so you can ask questions throughout the course of the webinar. We'll answer them as they come up if we can, but there will also be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar for anything that might pop up after we move on to a new section. All right, and then we also always like to start off with a brief introduction of our organization for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. So here at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, we believe in making the right investments today so that our state can thrive tomorrow. We believe policy decisions should be made out in the open in a way that is understandable and transparent to ordinary Idahoans. And we also believe that lawmakers make better decisions when they also have more information and have access to more data. So when we are doing this work, this is the scope that we try to build all of our work around. How can we make sure that we're helping people understand really complex policies? And how can we make sure lawmakers understand that? And how can we help people engage in that process? And we do that through a number of different policy areas. And those include budget and taxation, economic security, public education, affordable housing, and criminal justice. With the way that the legislative session is panning out this year, our updates will primarily focus on that budget and taxation piece, and then we'll have a one short update related to affordable housing at the end. All right, so we will now dive into just some updates around the 2026 legislative session. I'm going to start with some general information and then we'll start getting a little bit more focused on revenue. I'll be the one going through this section, but May feel free to jump in with whatever context that you have too. We all experience the session a little bit differently. We're all watching different committees, so as many perspectives as we have is always helpful. Oop, how do I go back? There we go. All right. So we are now well underway into legislative session. During our January webinar update, the legislature had barely started, getting things moving, but we're now to a point where decisions are being made, bills are moving quickly, and we really do have to be paying attention to what's happening at the Capitol to make sure we don't miss anything. And just to give you a sense of how many bills that we are having to keep an eye on and how many bills all of our lawmakers are also having to consider, you can take a look at this bar chart that I have here at the bottom of this slide. And you can see here in the blue, that is the number of RSs that have been introduced this year and then every year back through 2021. And an RS is a routing slip, which means it's a piece of proposed legislation that gets heard by a committee, and then they decide whether or not that routing slip deserves to be printed into an actual bill. So last year in 2025, we had a record number of RSs that were introduced and a record number of bills that were introduced. And we could really feel that last year. It felt incredibly overwhelming to try and keep up with how many pieces of legislation we saw coming before the legislature. And this year, they are already beating those numbers as of the weekly reports. So, as of the end of last week, there were 663 RSs that were heard by committee, and 378 of those have been printed into bills. And those are all bills that we individually have to, check the names for, see if they're related to our work, and then dive in and see if there's something that we need to be paying attention to. So there's a lot of time and capacity that goes toward just understanding what all of these RSs are. Um, May, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just thought I thought I was hoping that it would return back to normal this year after we had that record number last year. But yeah, it's just surprising that it just keeps going up and up and up. And just it's a lot more to keep track of. Yeah. And something else interesting is I was curious about what your sine die target date was, Kendra. I think they're going to last a little bit longer this year. I don't know if they're going to get out March 27th just because those budget bills, some of the budget bills that they've passed out of JFAC still don't have bill numbers yet and haven't been considered. So I'm guessing it could take a little bit longer than March 27th, even though I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, so the sine die target date is the day that the legislature adjourns for the year. So it's called adjourning sine die. And before legislative session begins, leadership comes together and they decide what their target date is for that sine die adjournment. I have been hurt so many times in the past. They often don't meet that date, but I remain an eternal optimist. And I still firmly believe slash hope that they will be done by March 27th.
And I
Um,
respect that.
it's also my dad's birthday, and I just feel like it'd be lovely to be able to celebrate with him after that.
Lovely.
Um, but again, I've often been hurt by that optimism, so we'll see what they actually end up doing. Um, but that is a good point bringing up those important dates because they do impact the way that session is being run during different times of the session. So just wanted to highlight some of the kind of main ones. So one of the really big ones that we're navigating right now is the primary election filing period, which is happening this week. That filing period opened up yesterday. I believe it closes Friday. And that is an important date because all of Idaho's lawmakers in the Senate and the House will be up for re-election. So nobody has a safe seat at this point. And so while they're making all of these voting decisions leading up to the primary election filing period, there is a lot of thought going into, okay, like, how will this vote impact who might run against me or who might donate to another campaign? So there is a lot of thought that goes into just how what they do will impact their campaigns. So sometimes after we see the election or the filing period end, that's when we see a lot more of the controversial bills pop up because after that filing period, most of those lawmakers already know whether or not they have a challenger, whether that challenger is, more conservative, more progressive, just what they're really facing. So sometimes things stay a little quiet before that filing date. Um, the next major date is the transmittal deadline. That basically means that the legislature aims to have all House bills sent to the Senate and all Senate bills sent to the House by that date of March 9th. That is not a hard and fast rule. We will see a lot of bills switching chambers after that date. But for bills that aren't necessarily considered priority bills, like budget bills or bills that leadership really wants to move through, that's generally when we'll see those bills stop moving between chambers. Then the other important date is March 12th. That is the date that the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee has set to try and have all their budgets completed. As May mentioned, budgets have been moving a little slowly, so we'll see if that date's actually met or not. Um, yeah, before I move on, any other context you want to add to that, May?
Oh, I was just trying to find the bill number. I can't, but maybe if I find it by the end, there was a bill to limit the amount of bills that could be introduced to address some of this growth in the number of proposed legislation. And I'm not sure where that is in the process or if it's stalled, but it's an interesting one that I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens with that. All right, so with that general update, we'll move into some updates around Idaho's revenue and some of the decisions that have been made already. Before I dive into this, I do just like to do a refresher for those who may not have joined this webinar before or just need a reminder of why we're in the position we're in now. So bear with me for a couple minutes if you're already well versed in all this information. Oh, I should not be in charge of the PowerPoint today. So for those of you who have followed our work, you know that the Idaho legislature has cut income taxes 5 times over the last 5 years, and they've done that pretty substantially. As a result of that, we've seen our state revenues go down by about $4 billion since 2021, and it's estimated to be a loss of about $5 billion by fiscal year 2029, I believe. So that's a really substantial hit to our state revenue. And that means that our legislature now has less funding available to, make investments into our public education system, to ensure that Medicaid programs remain stable, to ensure that our roads are being taken care of and not, falling behind as our population continues to grow. Maintaining our public lands, all of these really incredible things that all of us benefit from. This is the funding that helps to do that. And as we whittle away at that funding, lawmakers then have to make decisions about what their priorities are and which programs will be cut. So that number is substantial, and that number is, having some really big impacts on decisions this year. Also, what we've seen from past cuts and holdbacks is that once a legislature decides to make decisions to cut funding for programs or cut funding for, take down different tax levels, it's really hard for the state to come back from that. One of the examples we like to use is from our education report that May put out back in 2025. And you can see that in 2022, our per pupil spending for education was, $10,640. Then we had a time of economic hardship. They cut some of that funding. Then it started to come back. Then there was another time of economic hardship. Then we started to come back. Then there was another time of economic hardship. And because they cut that funding so drastically in the early 2000s, the state of Idaho has still not recovered from that. And that's something that is a trend that we will likely see across programs as the state continues to whittle away funding for these programs. Also, as you're hearing conversations about, state funding, or sorry, state spending going up over the last, few years, That has been a major talking point in the legislature and during campaigns that, spending is out of control. We need to rein in our budget. And if you just look at the real numbers that you can see why they're making that argument. 2005, you're looking at $2.11 billion. And then 2026, you're looking at $5.62 billion. So that is almost over double. Um, but what's left out of the conversation is the fact that we have experienced quite a bit of inflation since then. And the state of Idaho has also seen a really substantial population growth happen since then. So once you actually take those numbers and adjust them per capita and then also put in inflation and the population growth, what you see is that our spending has actually remained pretty flat. So this rhetoric about spending going up and being out of control really isn't supported by the data. May, you work in this arena quite a bit by diving into the data. Is there anything you want to add to any of that?
I think you covered it all really well, but yeah, it's just that population adjustment just isn't talked about enough. Because when more people move to the state, more people are buying things, which drives up the sales tax, and more people are working here, so drives up the income tax. So that's really why you see that increase in revenue. But yeah, you touched on all of that, all the things that I would say.
Great, thank you. All right, so that brings us into the actual legislative session. Um, so as we were coming into this legislative session, revenues for the state were coming in less than expected. So we were coming into this legislative session kind of with this deficit mentality of, we spent more during the last legislative session than we actually brought in revenues, and now we need to find ways to make up for that. And we also need to take that into account for future years. So that's the mentality that the legislature came in with this year. But once we got some updates, we realized we actually didn't have a deficit, but that mentality still remained. So that remains a common theme for this legislative session and one of the primary things that they're really talking about. So before we dive in, I did want to also just kind of walk through what a standard budget process should look like so that you can understand, where we are in this process as we are giving all of these updates. So the budgeting process basically begins in the spring and summer of the previous year when all the agencies start putting together their requests and working with the governor's office to figure out, okay, what do we need to be able to function for the next year? The governor then works with his agencies and with his budget folks. And during the governor's State of the State address, which is the very first day of legislative session, the governor will then release his proposed budget for that year. The legislature does not have to abide by that proposal, but it does provide a good starting point for where those conversations can be. So this year, the governor did release his budget proposal, with that State of the State address. Then after that, oh, I forgot what that acronym stands for. May, can you help me out?
Yeah. The Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee, they call it ERAC, which is not a pleasant thing to say, but yes, it's a committee that needs to hear from all the economists on how the economy in Idaho is doing.
Yeah, so they all meet and they give uh, um, recommendations for the projections for the revenue for the next year. That recommendation then goes to the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. That's the committee that is made up of both House and Senate members, and they're the ones that really hold the purse strings in the legislature. And we call them JFAC. And JFAC will use those recommendations to set their revenue target. So basically establishing their budget for the year. So we have now gone through all three parts of that process. The next part is JFAC then begins to approve agency maintenance budgets. This is part of a new process that JFAC started doing only a few years ago. With that being said, it is still a process that is not consistent, is not transparent, and there's still a lot of questions about it, including this year. But the way that we were initially explained these maintenance budgets was that these are the budgets that keep the lights on for the agencies. It allows them to do their constitutional duties, keeps the agencies running, and is a bare bones budget. So they approve those, and then anything in addition to that would be handled in supplemental bills or enhancements, which would come later. So JFAC at this time has approved all of the maintenance budgets, which we'll get to in a moment. Um, and then the supplementals and enhancements have been kind of slowly starting to show up. But I will point out that last year, this is not the order they did everything in. So we are happy that this year they're at least doing it like, in a much more responsible order. Okay, so one thing that did throw a little bit of a wrench into this process this year was House Bill 559, which was dealing with tax conformity. So during last spring, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and in that act, there were several tax codes that were changed, both at the corporate level and income or individual income taxes. And when changes like that are made at the federal level, states then have the option to decide whether or not they will conform to those changes. Oftentimes, states do choose to conform because it's helpful for individuals and businesses to be able to keep, one set of books. But some of these just don't make sense for the states to conform to. So, a big question coming into this legislative session was whether or not Idaho would conform to the changes that were included in OB3. And a big part of that was the fact that this is actually a pretty expensive conformity bill as opposed to past ones. And in light of the deficit that we were experiencing before session, there was also a lot of concern about, whittling away at our revenue when we already were seeing less revenue coming in. So there were several different estimates that came in on how expensive this conformity would cost. We've ultimately decided to go with the estimate that came from the Idaho Tax Commission, which is also the lowest estimate. And they believe that it'll cost about $175 million annually in revenue for us to have conformed in this. We did testify in opposition to this bill because we did feel that the fiscal note was not accurate and that and that the estimates were much lower than they actually would be. There were also some provisions that weren't really addressed in the estimate. So we felt like the fiscal note needed some more work before it would move forward. Um, Despite that, House Bill 559 did pass through the House and the Senate, I believe on party lines in both chambers. And then it has been signed into law by Governor Little. So the state has decided to conform to tax conformity. Although they didn't include bonus depreciation, I will not get into the weeds on that today, but it would have been very expensive for the state to do that. Um, and then another note is that the legislature did decide to veer from the governor's recommendation and decided to make conformity retroactive to tax year 2025. Um, and that is the tax year, we're all currently filing for. So the governor, his initial proposal had that start in tax year 26, so that it would be a change that would be accounted for next year, and it would give the tax commission a year to be able to figure out how to handle that. But the legislature wanted to make it retroactive because some of the individual provisions expire at the end of tax year 28. So what that has led to is kind of a mad dash for the tax commission to figure out how to implement these tax changes. It will also require people that have already filed to go in and put in amended filings. So it's going to be a bit of a mess while they figure this all out. And to help them do that, they did have to approve additional funding. There's currently a trailer bill that is allocating an additional $765,000 to the tax commission to implement all these changes. And again, this was not a cost that was included in the fiscal note. So that just highlights the fact that the fiscal note in House Bill 559 was leaving out some pretty substantial costs. May again was the one who led all of the work tracking this. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess I can just plug a little like PSA that if you think you might be eligible for like overtime tips, deductions, things like that, maybe wait to file a little bit so you don't have to file an amended return. Because that's probably people that have already filed might have to go back and amend their tax return if they qualify for some of those new things that just got passed the legislature. But yeah, like you said, it's a bit of a mess. So hopefully, I mean, I'm wishing the tax commission the best as they try to navigate all of these changes.
I admittedly always wait until the last day to file my taxes, so at least now I have an excuse.
There you go.
All right, and then just to talk about the maintenance budgets, if you might recall, that's the first round of funding that the legislature handles. These are the budgets that keep the lights on. So, coming into this legislative session, there was this deficit mentality. So, the governor and the legislature were already looking at ways that they could claw back basically some of the funding from that was allocated last year for this current fiscal year from the agencies. And so the governor put out his recommendations on what he felt that the agencies could reasonably afford, and that was 3%. So 3% of their allocations from last year, they were hoping to whittle it down by that. And then they were also looking at how they could cut those budgets in the future as well. And the governor's recommendation was also 3%. So 3% for fiscal year 26, which is our current year, and then 3% ongoing from fiscal year 27 and onward. And that was done again through working with the agencies really closely, getting a good understanding of where they could cut costs. A lot of this came from any positions that hadn't been filled, like within certain agencies or, cutting programs, things like that. And that's already a pretty substantial difference. Because remember, our legislature has already been running a very tight budget. So cutting that by 3% really does impact these agencies and these programs pretty significantly. But the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee wanted to take that even further. So for the fiscal year budget, they wanted to add an additional 1% for a total 4% reduction for fiscal year 26. And then they wanted to add 2% for fiscal year 27 and onward, meaning they're looking at a 5% reduction for fiscal year 27, which again is very substantial and will have impacts on programs. The governor's budget chief, Lori Wolf, she released, I believe there was a letter to JFAC. It might have been a memo, but she highlighted some of the ways that those additional cuts could really end up costing the state in the long run. I forgot to look up the specific numbers again, but for example, the Commission on Pardons and Parole, if they cut five or the additional 2%, I think it costs I think the savings was about $80,000. But because that would slow down the number of parole hearings that they could effectively get through in a month, and that meant that people would be incarcerated for longer under state supervision, which is paid for by the tax dollars. The extra cost that would be transferred to corrections was around, I think, $500,000. Don't quote me on those numbers, but the difference was pretty similar to that. And so they found several examples of how these additional cuts that the legislature is pushing for would actually do more harm in the long run. Despite that feedback from the executive branch, uh, JFAC did vote to move forward with these 4% and 5% cuts. And the Friday before last, they approved the maintenance budgets for all the agencies that reflect these changes. So JFAC has approved these changes at this time, but they have not gone before the House chamber and the Senate chamber to be voted on yet. So if you would like to protect this funding and protect the programs that the general fund supports, encourage everybody to be reaching out to their lawmakers and letting them know that this is not a choice that you support and you would support having more revenue at the state level so that we could make sure that we're taking care of the state first and foremost. Again, this is May's main policy area. Anything you'd like to add?
Just that, I mean, just to reinforce really what you said, Lori Wolf's memo was really clear that most of these cuts that agencies make will result in bigger expenses down the line. So it just creates some structural harm to the budget because if you cut a little here It's like cutting, I forget, there's a phrase that goes with it, but like uh, but yeah, so like just cutting little bits now is going to have a huge expense down the line. As something else important to note is that, like Kendra also mentioned earlier, to reinforce it, is that these budgets didn't need to be cut further. Revenues ended up coming in ahead. There wasn't a deficit when these cuts were made. There was some money still on the bottom line. But since the co-chairs wanted more money on the bottom line, they implemented these cuts with the promise that when the enhancement budgets come forward, they'll consider adding programs back. But we just haven't seen how that will play out yet. We'll have to wait for the next couple weeks to see which programs they choose to bring back.
Oh, that is a really good point, May. So when JFAC was considering these maintenance budgets, there were several lawmakers who were concerned about the fact that these maintenance budgets were not providing enough funding for agencies to be able to do their jobs. And when that was brought up, the chairman did frequently just keep saying, the work groups will handle it. The work groups will handle it. But those work groups are meet in non-public settings, so there's not the ability for us to know what they're talking about. Also, there's no guarantee that they will address any of the issues that were brought up. So there were assurances that, the work groups will take care of these concerns, but again, there's nothing really showing up to back that up yet. So we really don't know what that looks like. All right. We were hoping we wouldn't have to talk about vouchers again this
I
year,
know,
but here we are. So May, I'll hand it over to you to take it away.
for sure. Thanks, Kendra. So, Um, something that was included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in July last year was the creation of a federal school voucher program in the form of a tax credit, similar to Idaho's school voucher program. So, with some difference. So, this federal program would states would have to opt into it to participate, and they would have to regulate these organizations called scholarship granting organizations. People could donate up to 1,700, well, they can donate however much they want, but they could get $1,700 back in the form of a tax credit. So a dollar for dollar tax credit up to $1,700, donating into that fund. And then the organization then would grant scholarships to people for qualified education expenses. Um, right now, it looks like public school students would be able to apply for scholarships alongside private school students, but we don't have final um, regulations from the IRS yet. So it could that could change, I guess, who's qualified and what expenses are qualified. Um, And something else important to note is that private school students could get this tax credit scholarship from the scholarship granting organization on top of the tax credit that they can get now through House Bill 93 from last year. So all of this together, how do we opt in, right? So because each state has to opt in. So the governor last month said that it was his intention to opt in. And this month he issued just last week an executive order directing the Idaho Department of Education to implement this program. That they would have to qualify those scholarship granting organizations, like who's allowed to give out these scholarships and collect this revenue. Um, and then at the same time, like pretty much actually it was the same day. House Bill 731 was introduced in the House Revenue and Taxation Committee to codify the executive order that would come out later in the day. But it was sent straight to the second reading calendar. So it totally circumvented having a hearing in committee and just went straight to the House floor to get voted on. So that was disappointing to see that lack of transparency and the public hearing process get totally circumvented there. Um, something else, just to give you a little bit more information about this program. Um, so it costs at least, or like the estimate is about $4 billion at the federal level, because this is a federal tax credit. Um, and it's 3 times more generous than donations to other charitable causes. So usually when you donate to a charity, you get a tax credit back of about like 30% of your donation. And this is like a dollar for dollar, so it's a 100% match. And it's a really sharp departure from what the federal government usually funds for education. Usually they give disbursements based on how many low-income students are in the area or special needs students through the IDEA. So this is very different than anything that they've ever done before, a very sharp departure from tradition. And something else to note here, an unintended consequence that we've started to see from the passage of House Bill 93 in Idaho is that private school tuitions have risen by exactly $5,000, that amount that parents can qualify for to get reimbursed for their child's private education expense. And this would probably just contribute to that trend. So there's a lot of frustrating aspects in this decision and how it's been made. But it's something to keep an eye on going forward because this fiscal note in House Bill 731 was like, oh, there's no fiscal note because this is a federal like program. We're just formalizing that we're accepting it. However, it will still take resources at the Idaho Department of Education to administer the program, make sure the scholarship granting organizations are qualified and that they're doing everything they need to do. So it still will take some resources at the department. Um, Kendra, did I miss anything there?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. I think I got through the notes there, but yeah, it's a lot. If you guys have questions, feel free to email me after this or drop them in the chat. Um,
We also do have a report on this policy when it was passed through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on our website, if you're
yes,
interested in getting into some of the specifics. It is a very complex policy.
it is. Yeah. I'm sure that there will be a lot of marketing around it once everything gets up and going.
Yeah.
Um, just like there was around House Bill 93. So, there was also some really great developments and bad at I guess good and bads here for special education funding. So we've now heard from officials that the special education funding gap has grown to over $100 million. So what that means is the the gap between what the state provides to local school districts and what school districts actually pay for special education, that gap is 100 million. And it's not like it's not getting funded, but it is getting funded through supplemental levies, property tax increases at the local level to schools. Um, so there was an effort last year to get some more special education funding. Um, like when Kendra was going through the timeline, the Department of Ed, the superintendent, Debbie Critchfield, she put forward a proposal in her agency request. I'd like $50 million to help address this gap in special ed funding. But when the 3% budget cuts came forward, she had to withdraw that request for 50 million. So she got creative and worked with some lawmakers to bring these two bills forward that work together. So House Bill 1317, it creates regional service centers that help rural schools share hard to find special education staff. So it doesn't really cost anything for the state, but what it does is it helps create a mechanism for local districts to share resources for special education aides and nurses and things like that. To help whittle down costs so that each district doesn't have to have their own, that they can share teachers. So that has passed out of committee and it's waiting to be heard on the Senate floor. I'm thinking it'll probably be heard this week. It's not too far down the calendar. And then Senate Bill 1288 creates a $5 million high need student fund with one-time funds. So they got creative and found some money that they could pull together to create this fund or to fund this fund for the first time. So it would help districts and charters cover the cost of full-time special education aides like nurses and ASL interpreters, other interpreters, things like that. Um, so this bill was brought last year as well, and it barely passed out of the House, and then it failed by one vote in the Senate. It was very disappointing. And so we're really hopeful that this year this bill will pass, especially since it is with one-time fundings. We hope to see it funded continuously in the future for future budget requests. But right now, it's a step in the right direction. I mean, these things are really just a drop in the bucket to address that $100 million funding gap. But we're glad to see that some legislation is coming forward. And we provided written testimony in support of Senate Bill 1288 as well. And it passed out of committee. It's also waiting to be heard on the Senate floor. And this one's the one that's actually not too far down the Senate calendar. I think we're actually waiting on Senate Bill 1317 to appear, but they're both in that same section of the process. Um, Anything to add, Kendra?
Mostly I had a question. I realize I haven't asked this before.
Hmm.
That special education funding gap of $100 million, is that annually or is that cumulative?
Annually.
I mean, it hurts
Yes.
no matter what, but yeah,
I
that
know.
hurts.
Yeah. So it's really it's really, really hard on districts because when they don't get enough funding from the federal government or the state, like they're just appealing to the people that live in their communities to raise their property taxes to help pay these funding gaps. So really, if they fund this, it's a form of property tax relief, I suppose. Help just get districts more money that they can use on these needed areas.
Great. Now, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. All right. I think that's is that all my nope, I have one more.
There you go.
All right, more with school funding. So school facilities funding has been brought up a lot over the last couple years. There's been several bills to address it because it has been a real big problem at the local level. I mean, at the state level, it's just like a state funding problem for local districts. So these two bills have support from legislative leadership. They're actually moving pretty quickly through the process, and it's to help grease the wheels a bit for some school facilities funding. So House Bill 608 would eliminate a provision in the Public School Facilities Cooperative Fund, which requires districts to try unsuccessfully to pass a bond measure before qualifying for the revolving loan program. What does all that mean? So there's a loan program, so school districts, if they don't have enough funding for a school building, they can apply to get a loan from the state to help them build a school building. Something that was in this law in years past was that school districts have to show that they have tried and failed to pass a bond at the local level in order to qualify for this loan program. This gets rid of that qualification, and superintendents testified saying that it just created a lot of distrust in their community if they're going out and asking for a bond, and then saying like, oh, but I mean, we could go get a loan if this fails. So to really just be more clear about it is an option to try to seek a loan as well as seek a bond, and that you don't have to fail to pass in order to qualify. So that one's already passed all the way through the House and it's waiting for a hearing in Senate Education. I believe that they're actually going to hear it this afternoon. So that's exciting. We'll keep you guys updated on that. And actually, it's the same status for the next one. House Bill 636. It fixes something from House Bill 292 from, I forget if 292 was last year or the year before. It has been so many, but in a little while ago, House Bill 292 was passed and it was a property tax relief bill, using school funding to provide property tax relief by getting school districts money to pay off their bonds and levies. That way it rolls off of everyone's property tax bill. Um, and it didn't really do much for actually helping with school facilities because schools that still needed additional facilities, they had to use that money to pay off their existing debt first before they could put any of that money towards school buildings. This bill, House Bill 636, would say add to this waterfall of funding, like, oh, first you have to pay off bond and levy debt. Um, then you pay off your overdue maintenance, and then you pay off all of these things before you can use it for a new school. This adds to that a waterfall of funding and saying like you could also, instead of using it to build a new school, you could use it to make a lease purchase of a building for you to use to educate your students in. So it allows some more flexibility for schools that maybe don't have enough funding to just build a new building or purchase one. And so that one will also be heard in Senate Education later today. Yep, and we plan on having a little bit longer of a piece written about this in the coming weeks. All right, I think that's it for me.
All right, thank you, May. All right, one last update related to housing. I wasn't sure if we'd actually get any housing legislation that we'd be sharing about this year, but we did finally see one really good renter consumer protection bill come through, and that's House Bill 701. So last year, a very similar bill was introduced, but it ultimately didn't move forward. Um, and effectively, what House Bill 701 does is it creates some really important consumer protections for renters who are applying for a new home. Under the current law, there's nothing preventing, some bad actor coming into the state, putting up a posting for a rental home, and then accepting application fees and applications from as many applicants as they want. And then just holding on to the money that they earned from collecting those fees. This was especially a huge problem during the pandemic when we saw a huge shortage of rentals happening across the state and people were having a really hard time finding a place to live. That is still true. It's just not quite as dire as it was a couple of years ago. Um, but what this does is it basically emulates best practices in the industry anyway. So one of the main things that it does is it limits the actual collection of application fees to two applicants at a time. So whoever's first in line to be considered, and then the second person in line, um, and nobody else. Unless these two applicants fall through for some reason, then they can go down the line and continue to collect application fees as it comes up. But that just ensures that the people who are being charged application fees are the ones who are actually being considered for these units. It also requires that a property actually be available. There is not a law requiring that a rental advertisement for a rental property has to actually be real. So this would require that the property exist and that the property actually be available, which again is very helpful. And then the third major thing it does is it requires the cost of the application fee to actually be associated with the actual cost for processing the application. So there were some bad actors that came into the state and they were charging just really expensive application fees for, apartments. I think one of the highest ones I heard was about $300 for an application fee. And, if you're a family living paycheck to paycheck, $300 is substantial. So this ensures that when folks are saying what their application fees are, that they at least be in line with what it actually costs for a background check to be run and the other things that they would be doing. So again, this basically reflects best practices within the industry, and we are very supportive of this bill being passed. It has been printed in the House Business Committee, and it's still awaiting its public hearing. So if you would like to take action on this bill, reach out to lawmakers and ask them to support it. You can use the QR code on here to go to our action tool that helps you send an email to the entire committee. But we really just want the committee to know that we do support, enhanced consumer protections for renters, and there's really a need for it. So please take action if you feel so inclined. Um, oh, this is a new slide. May, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes, sorry, it looks like some of my text got cut off there. So, this is an action alert to stop the state budget cuts that we've talked about, that will have really detrimental effects down the line. So, it's asking lawmakers to not make permanent cuts to the state budget that will impact the legislature's current and future ability to fund the programs and agencies that keep our communities safe, clean, healthy, and educated. This action alert will take you to an action tool and will send to your lawmakers, even if they're not on the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. You can urge your lawmakers to urge their friends on the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee to take action to stop these really harmful budget cuts, and to support the enhancement budgets that are coming forward. Um, yeah, so that is that one too. You can use the QR code there. And I can actually, I think I'll find the link and I can throw it in the chat too.
Cool. I was about to ask you for that. All right, well, that does bring us to the end of our webinar. As always, if you want to stay up to date on what's happening in the Capitol more frequently than monthly, highly encourage you to sign up for our newsletter by going to our website, idahofiscal.org. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and we are doing our best to make our TikTok right now, too. So feel free to find us there as well. Um, Also, in addition to that, we are not funded by government funding. We, rely on individual donations from folks like yourself who support our work to be able to do this work and share the work with the public. So if you ever do feel inclined, you can also donate to our organization on our website as well. Um, oh, and then I
You
see May,
copy that over for me.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, there's the hyperlink for the action tool for the tax cuts. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but we are open for question and answer right now if anyone's interested. So while we give folks a little bit of time to type out a question if they have one, May, do you have any closing thoughts?
Oh, just that I still am feeling hopeful for this session, that we will get some of these items back in the enhancement budgets, especially the most harmful ones. So I'm trying to keep up hope there, keep my fingers crossed, and not get too pessimistic over here, because a lot we have seen how stories really do impact changes at the legislature, and they really do read emails. Phone calls are even better, if you are so inclined to pick up the phone and call your lawmaker, because we have seen how those personal stories from their constituents will really sway them one way or another on what to support and what to reject. So thank you so much for being engaged and attending these webinars and keeping a pulse on what's going on in Idaho. Definitely really appreciate it. Every voice matters.
Yeah, I agree with everything May said. Tax policy is not a fun thing to necessarily follow unless you're a big old nerd like me and May. But it is really, important. And if you are, supportive of other funding for the government and programs and supporting other Idahoans, like tax policy really is at the foundation of all of that. So thank you all for spending the time to learn a little bit more about it and also to join us for these updates. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think we can go ahead and close out. I will leave the webinar running for just a couple more minutes if people want to snag any of the links or emails in the chat. Um, but as always, feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.